Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that sounds like complete fiction, but is devastatingly real. The story of a single servant who brought down one of history's most powerful empires. Not through armies or assassination, but through patience, cunning, and the kind of quiet revenge that takes decades to unfold. This is the story of how one man's humiliation became an empire's destruction. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are Chang Wei, and you wake up to the sound of bells echoing across the Forbidden City. The year is 1644, and you've just opened your eyes to what will become the most important day in Chinese history. But you don't know that yet. Right now, you're just another face in the endless sea of palace servants, eunuchs, and attendants who keep the Ming Dynasty's elaborate machine running. Your quarters are small, cramped, and shared with 3 other servants who snore in harmonious discord. The walls are thin paper and wood, and you can hear every cough, every whisper, every prayer from the neighboring rooms. Your mattress is little more than straw wrapped in rough cotton, and your blanket has seen better decades. There's no privacy, no comfort, and certainly no dignity. You're not even allowed to look directly at most of the people you serve. Your morning begins before dawn, as it has for the past 15 years. You dress in the simple blue cotton robe that marks you as palace staff, tie your hair back in the regulation style, and shuffle to the wash basins along with dozens of other servants. The water is cold, the soap is harsh, and the mirror shows you a face that's aged far beyond its years. You're 35, but you look 50. That's what happens when you live in constant fear of making a mistake that could cost you your life. The Ming court doesn't forgive errors. It punishes them with creative brutality that would make executioners from other dynasties take notes. You've been here since you were 20, brought in as a low-ranking attendant after your family sold you to pay their debts. That's not unusual. The Forbidden City is full of people who didn't choose to be here. Some are eunuchs who were castrated as children and handed over to the palace. Others are servants like you, essentially slaves with slightly better food and marginally less chance of random death. You serve tea, clean floors, carry messages, and try to remain invisible. In the Ming Palace, visibility equals vulnerability. The moment someone notices you, the moment you become memorable, is the moment your life becomes infinitely more dangerous. The hierarchy here is suffocating. Above you are the senior servants, the ones who've survived long enough to earn small privileges like better quarters or the right to speak without permission. Above them are the eunuchs, castrated men who serve as intermediaries between the servants and the imperial family. Above them are the lower-ranking nobles, then the higher-ranking nobles, then the imperial family itself. And at the very top, the emperor, a man so far above your station that even thinking about him directly feels like blasphemy. You've seen him maybe 3 times in 15 years, and each time you were required to prostrate yourself so completely that your forehead touched the ground and stayed there until he passed. You are, in the most literal sense, beneath notice. But today is different. Today, you're assigned to serve in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where the Emperor holds court. This is both an honor and a terror. It means you're trusted enough to be in the presence of the most powerful people in the Empire. But it also means that any mistake, any small error, could result in your immediate execution. You've heard stories of servants who spilled tea and were beaten to death, of attendants who coughed at the wrong moment and were dragged away, never to be seen again. The Ming court operates on a principle of absolute perfection, and servants are expected to be perfectly invisible, perfectly silent, and perfectly disposable. As you walk through the endless corridors of the Forbidden City, you pass rooms filled with treasures that could buy entire provinces. Jade sculptures, silk tapestries, golden artifacts, and paintings worth more than most people will see in a lifetime. But you're not allowed to look. You're not allowed to appreciate. You're not allowed to exist in any meaningful way. You're a ghost in a palace of gods, and ghosts don't have opinions, desires, or dreams. They simply serve and suffer and eventually disappear. The Hall of Supreme Harmony is vast, cold, and absolutely terrifying. The ceiling stretches impossibly high, decorated with dragons and phoenixes carved from precious woods and inlaid with gold. The throne sits at the far end, elevated on a platform that seems designed to make anyone approaching it feel small and insignificant. Which, of course, is exactly the point. The emperor doesn't just rule through laws and armies. He rules through architecture, through ceremony, through the constant reminder that he is not just a man, but a divine being whose will shapes reality itself. You take your position along the wall with the other servants, trying to make yourself as small and invisible as possible. The courtiers begin to file in, dressed in elaborate robes that cost more than your family's house. These are the most powerful people in the empire, men who control provinces, command armies, and decide the fate of millions. But even they prostrate themselves when the emperor enters. Even they become shadows in the presence of the Son of Heaven. The emperor is Emperor Chongzhen, the last of the Ming Dynasty, though, of course, nobody knows that yet. He's a man in his 30s, thin, nervous, and carrying the weight of an empire that's slowly collapsing around him. The Ming Dynasty has ruled China for nearly 3 centuries, but now it's facing rebellions, famines, and invasions that threaten to tear it apart. The emperor seems to sense this. There's something desperate in his eyes, something that suggests he knows he's fighting a losing battle against forces he can't control. But you're not thinking about the emperor's problems. You're thinking about your own survival. Your job today is simple. Serve tea to the courtiers, refill cups, and remain completely invisible. You've done this hundreds of times before, but today feels different. There's tension in the air, whispered conversations, worried glances. Something is happening beyond the walls of the Forbidden City. Something that has the most powerful people in the empire nervous. The court session begins with the usual rituals. Announcements, appointments, ceremonial presentations. You move through your duties mechanically, pouring tea, bowing at the appropriate moments, saying nothing. But you're listening. You're always listening. In 15 years of serving in the palace, you've learned that servants hear everything and are expected to remember nothing. Courtiers speak freely in front of servants because servants are not considered human enough to matter. They discuss military strategies, political alliances, personal scandals, and state secrets as if you're furniture. And in a way, you are. You're functional, necessary, and utterly without agency. But today you hear something that makes your blood run cold. The courtiers are discussing a rebel named Li Zicheng, a man who has been leading peasant uprisings across northern China. They're not just talking about him as a distant threat anymore. They're talking about him as an immediate danger. His army is approaching Beijing. They're discussing evacuation plans, emergency protocols, and the possibility that the capital itself might fall. The Ming Dynasty, which has seemed eternal and unshakable, is apparently on the verge of collapse. And as you listen to these powerful men discuss the end of the world as they know it, you feel something you haven't felt in years. Not fear, not despair, but a strange kind of excitement. Because you have a secret that none of these courtiers know. You have a connection to the outside world that they can't imagine. You have a brother, your brother Jiang Wei is not a servant. He's a soldier, but not in the Imperial Army. He's been fighting with the rebels for 3 years now, ever since the famine of 1641 destroyed his farm and killed his children. He joined Li Zicheng's army not out of political conviction, but out of desperation and rage. The Ming government had failed him, had let his family starve while the emperor lived in luxury. And now he's part of an army that's marching toward Beijing, toward the very palace where you've spent 15 years serving tea and swallowing humiliation. But your brother isn't just any soldier. He's risen through the ranks to become one of Li Zicheng's most trusted commanders. And for the past year, he's been receiving detailed intelligence about the imperial palace, about troop movements, about the emperor's plans and fears. That intelligence has been coming from you. You've been passing information to your brother through a network of servants, merchants, and sympathizers who have been quietly working to bring down the dynasty that has crushed them under its heel. You didn't start as a spy. You started as a broken man who had no choice but to serve. But over the years, as you watch the incredible waste, the casual cruelty, the utter indifference to human suffering that characterized the Ming court, something hardened inside you. You began to understand that the empire you served was not divinely ordained, but simply organized brutality. The emperor was not a god, but a man who had been given unlimited power and had used it to create a system that existed solely to serve his own interests. So when your brother first contacted you 3 years ago, you were ready. You were ready to become more than just a servant. You were ready to become an instrument of revenge. Not just for yourself, but for every peasant who had starved while the emperor held banquets, for every family that had been destroyed by imperial taxes, for every person who had been ground down by a system that treated human beings as expendable resources. The information you've been passing to your brother has been invaluable. You've told him about the palace's defenses, about the emperor's daily routines, about the locations of treasures and weapons. You've identified which courtiers are loyal and which are wavering. You've provided maps of the Forbidden City's layout, information about secret passages, and details about the Emperor's escape plans. Every piece of intelligence has been carefully gathered over months and years, passed along through a network so careful and so patient that even you don't know all of its members. But your most important contribution hasn't been information. It's been something much more valuable. You've been systematically destroying the empire from within. Not through sabotage or violence, but through the quiet, methodical work of turning the imperial bureaucracy against itself. You've been spreading rumors, creating conflicts, and fostering the kind of paranoia and distrust that makes effective governance impossible. When courtiers have argued over military strategy, you've made sure that their arguments became personal feuds. When generals have disagreed about troop deployments, you've ensured that their disagreements became bitter rivalries. When the emperor has tried to implement reforms, you've made sure that those reforms were undermined by the very people who were supposed to implement them. You've been playing a game that requires infinite patience and perfect invisibility. You've been slowly poisoning the empire, one whispered conversation at a time. And now, as you stand in the Hall of Supreme Harmony listening to the most powerful people in China discuss their impending doom, you realize that your work is almost complete. The empire is about to fall, and you've been one of the people pushing it toward its collapse. The irony is almost beautiful. The Ming Dynasty, which has ruled through fear and oppression, is being destroyed by the very system it created. The servants, who were supposed to be invisible, have become its most dangerous enemies. The people who were considered too lowly to matter have become the instruments of its destruction. The empire that treated human beings as disposable resources is about to discover that disposable resources can be surprisingly resourceful when they decide to dispose of their disposers. But you're not celebrating yet. You know that the most dangerous moment is still ahead. Li Zicheng's army is approaching Beijing, but the city is still defended. The emperor still has loyal troops, still has the resources to fight back. The battle for the capital will be brutal, and there's no guarantee that the rebels will win. You've spent 3 years preparing for this moment, but now that it's here, you feel the weight of what you've done. You've helped to start a civil war. You've contributed to the collapse of a dynasty. You've played a role in events that will affect millions of people. The servant who was supposed to be invisible has become one of the most important people in Chinese history, and nobody knows it but you. The court session continues, but you're no longer really paying attention to the formal proceedings. You're watching the faces of the courtiers, reading their expressions, gauging their fear. These are men who have spent their lives believing that they were untouchable, that their positions were secure, that the natural order of things would always protect them. Now they're discovering that the natural order can change very quickly and very violently. The hunters are about to become the hunted, and they're finally beginning to understand what that means. Emperor Chongzhen himself seems to sense that something fundamental has shifted. He's trying to maintain the ceremonial dignity that his position requires, but there's something frantic in his movements, something desperate in his voice. He's issuing orders, making proclamations, trying to reassert control over a situation that has already spiraled beyond his ability to manage. But his orders are being followed reluctantly, if at all. His proclamations are being received with skepticism. His attempts to reassert control are being met with barely concealed contempt. The emperor is discovering that power is not inherent but consensual, and that consent can be withdrawn. As the morning progresses, reports begin to arrive from the city. Li Zicheng's army has reached the outskirts of Beijing. The city's defenses are being tested. Imperial troops are deserting in increasing numbers. The situation is deteriorating rapidly, and there's a growing sense that the capital might fall within days, if not hours. The courtiers are beginning to panic, and their panic is becoming contagious. The carefully maintained order of the imperial court is starting to break down, and through it all, you continue to serve tea. You continue to bow at the appropriate moments. You continue to remain invisible, because your work is not yet finished. Even as the empire collapses around you, even as the dynasty you've spent 3 years undermining finally begins to crumble, you still have a role to play. You still have information to gather, still have chaos to sow, still have revenge to extract. The servant who was supposed to be nothing has become everything, and the empire that was supposed to be eternal is about to become history. The emperor calls for an emergency session with his closest advisors. The courtiers file out, leaving you and the other servants to clean up the hall. But you're not just cleaning. You're listening to the conversations that continue in the corridors, the desperate planning sessions, the increasingly frantic attempts to develop some kind of response to the crisis. And everything you hear, you remember. Everything you remember, you will pass along. The servant who was supposed to be invisible has become the most visible person in the empire, even though nobody can see him. As you work, you think about your brother, somewhere outside the city walls with Li Zicheng's army. You think about the years of humiliation, the daily degradation, the constant fear that had defined your life in the palace. You think about the emperor, who had lived in luxury while people starved. You think about the courtiers, who had made policy decisions that destroyed lives without ever having to face the consequences. And you feel something that you haven't felt in 15 years. Satisfaction. Not happiness exactly, but a deep sense that justice is finally being served. The afternoon brings more reports, and each one is worse than the last. The city's outer defenses have been breached. Imperial troops are retreating. Rebel forces are advancing through the streets. The capital is falling, and there's nothing the emperor can do to stop it. The Ming Dynasty, which has ruled China for nearly 3 centuries, is collapsing in a matter of hours. And you, the invisible servant, have been one of the primary architects of its destruction. But even as the empire falls, you don't allow yourself to relax. You know that the most dangerous moment is still ahead. When Li Zicheng's forces enter the palace, when the rebels take control of the Forbidden City, you will need to reveal yourself. You will need to step out of the shadows and acknowledge your role in what has happened. You will need to become visible. And that's the most terrifying prospect of all, because you've spent so many years being invisible that you're not sure you remember how to be seen. The evening brings the sound of fighting from the city streets. Gunfire, shouting, the crash of gates being broken down. The rebels are in Beijing, and they're fighting their way toward the palace. The emperor has barricaded himself in his private chambers with his most loyal guards, but even they seem to understand that the end is near. The imperial system is collapsing, and there's no power on earth that can prevent it. You're still serving, still cleaning, still maintaining the pretense of being nothing more than a servant. But inside, you're preparing for the moment when everything changes. You're preparing to reveal yourself to your brother, to Li Zicheng, to the world. You're preparing to step out of the shadows and claim your place in history. The servant who brought down an empire is about to become visible. The night is filled with the sounds of battle, but by morning the fighting is over. Li Zicheng's forces have taken the palace. The emperor is dead, having hanged himself rather than face capture. The Ming Dynasty is finished, and a new chapter in Chinese history is about to begin. And you, the invisible servant, have been one of the most important people in making it happen. When your brother finds you in the wreckage of the Hall of Supreme Harmony, he barely recognizes you. 15 years in the palace have changed you, aged you, made you into someone he doesn't immediately remember. But when you speak, when you tell him about the years of patient work, the careful intelligence gathering, the systematic destruction of the imperial system from within, he understands. He understands that his little brother, the one who was sold into servitude to pay the family's debts, has become one of the most successful spies in history. But the story doesn't end there, because Li Zicheng's rebellion, which you helped to make successful, ultimately fails. His army is defeated by the Manchus, who establish their own dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, which will rule China for the next 3 centuries. Your work has destroyed one empire only to make room for another. The servant who brought down the Ming Dynasty has simply helped to install new masters. And that's when you realize the true nature of what you've done. You haven't destroyed the imperial system, you've simply changed its management. The structures of oppression remain in place. The hierarchies of power continue to exist. The mechanisms of control are still functioning. You've spent 3 years systematically destroying an empire, only to discover that empires are not really destroyed. They're just replaced. But perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the point was never to create a perfect world, but simply to demonstrate that empires are not eternal. That power is not inherent, that the people who are supposed to be invisible can become the most visible of all. You've shown that a single servant, working patiently and carefully, can bring down forces that seem overwhelming. You've proven that the powerless are not really powerless, that the voiceless can find ways to speak, that the invisible can become the most important people in history. The servant who brought down an empire didn't create a revolution. He simply revealed that revolution is always possible. That empires fall not because they're attacked from without, but because they're undermined from within. That the people who seem to matter least often matter most. That power is not a possession, but a performance, and that performances can be disrupted by anyone with enough patience and enough rage. In the end, you don't become a hero, you don't become a leader, you don't become anything more than what you always were, a servant. But you've demonstrated that being a servant doesn't mean being powerless. It means being underestimated, and being underestimated can be the most powerful position of all. The Ming Dynasty fell in 1644, ending nearly 3 centuries of rule. The official histories blame military failures, economic problems, and natural disasters. They mention Li Zicheng's rebellion, the Manchu invasion, and the emperor's suicide. But they don't mention the servants who passed information, who sowed discord, who quietly undermined the system from within. They don't mention the invisible people who made the visible collapse possible. History is written by the winners, and the winners are always the people who are seen. But sometimes the most important people are the ones who are never seen at all. Sometimes the people who change the world are the ones who are supposed to be invisible. Sometimes the most powerful person in the empire is the one who serves the tea. The servant who brought down the Ming Dynasty returned to invisibility after the conquest. He served new masters, cleaned new halls, and carried new secrets. But he had learned something that no empire could take away from him: that power is not permanent, that hierarchies are not natural, and that the people who are supposed to be nothing can become everything. The invisible servant had become the most visible person in history, even though nobody could see him, and perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. That power is not really about being seen, it's about seeing. It's about understanding. It's about patience. It's about knowing that empires are not eternal, that dynasties are not permanent, and that the people who are supposed to be powerless are often the most powerful of all. The servant who brought down an empire didn't need to be visible to change the world. He just needed to be there, watching, waiting, and working. And sometimes that's enough. The story of the servant who brought down the Ming Dynasty is not really a story about one man. It's a story about the power of the powerless, the visibility of the invisible, and the strength of the weak. It's a story about how empires fall not because they're conquered, but because they're undermined. It's a story about how the people who matter least often matter most. And it's a story about how anyone, given enough time and enough determination, can change the world, even if they're just serving tea. The years that followed the fall of the Ming Dynasty were not kind to you. The Manchu conquerors, who established the Qing Dynasty, were suspicious of everyone who had served in the previous administration. They executed some former palace servants, exiled others, and kept the rest under careful surveillance. You managed to survive by once again becoming invisible, by demonstrating that you were nothing more than a harmless servant who had simply done his job and asked no questions. The irony was not lost on you. The man who had helped to bring down an empire was now pretending to be exactly what he had always appeared to be: nobody important. But you carried within you the knowledge of what you had accomplished. You knew that you had been present at one of the great turning points in history. You knew that your actions had helped to shape the destiny of the most populous nation on earth. You knew that the servant who was supposed to be invisible had become one of the most consequential people of his age, and that knowledge sustained you through the difficult years that followed. The new dynasty was, in many ways, similar to the old one. The emperor was still considered divine. The court was still filled with elaborate ceremonies and rigid hierarchies. Servants were still expected to be invisible, disposable, and utterly subservient. The system of oppression remained largely intact, with new faces in the same old roles. But there was one crucial difference. The new rulers understood that empires could fall. They had seen it happen. They had made it happen. and that knowledge made them both more paranoid and more careful. You found yourself assigned to serve in the new palace, cleaning the same halls where you had once plotted revolution. The rooms were redecorated, the ceremonies were slightly different, but the essential nature of imperial power remained unchanged. You still woke before dawn, still dressed in simple robes, still served tea to people who considered you less than human. But now you understood something that you hadn't understood before, that your invisibility was not a weakness, but a strength, that your position as a servant was not a disadvantage, but an opportunity, that the people who are overlooked are often the ones who see the most. The Qing dynasty would rule China for nearly 3 centuries, longer than the Ming dynasty had lasted. But it would eventually fall, just as the Ming had fallen. And when it did, there would be servants in the palace who would play a role in its collapse. There would be invisible people who would help to shape visible events. There would be individuals who would demonstrate, once again, that power is not permanent, and that the people who are supposed to be powerless are often the most powerful of all. But that's a story for another time. Your story, the story of the servant who brought down the Ming dynasty, had already been written. Not in the official histories which focused on emperors and generals and dramatic battles, but in the quiet moments when you had passed information to your brother, when you had sown discord among the courtiers, when you had systematically undermined the system from within. Your story was written in the spaces between the official narratives, in the moments when nobody was watching, in the actions that seemed too small to matter, but that ultimately changed everything. Years later, when you were an old man, you would sometimes tell parts of your story to younger servants. Not the whole story, of course. That would have been too dangerous. But fragments of it. Lessons about patience and observation, and the importance of understanding that power is not what it appears to be. You would tell them that servants see everything and are expected to remember nothing, but that remembering can be the most powerful thing of all. You would tell them that the people who are supposed to be invisible can become the most visible people in history, even if nobody ever sees them. Some of the younger servants understood what you were really saying. They understood that you were not just talking about serving tea and cleaning floors. You were talking about the possibility of change, about the power of the powerless, about the ways in which history is really made. And some of them, in their own time and in their own way, would carry forward the work that you had begun. They would demonstrate that empires are not eternal, that dynasties are not permanent, and that the people who are supposed to be nothing can become everything. The servant who brought down the Ming dynasty never received recognition for what he had done. His name was not recorded in the history books. His actions were not commemorated with monuments or ceremonies. He lived and died in obscurity, just another face in the endless succession of palace servants who had served and suffered and been forgotten. But he had changed the world. He had proven that one person, working patiently and carefully, could alter the course of history. He had shown that the most powerful empires could be brought down by the most powerless people. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, that history is not made by the people who are remembered, but by the people who are forgotten, that the most significant events are often caused by the most insignificant people, that the people who seem to matter least often matter most, that power is not about being seen, but about seeing, that empires fall not because they are conquered, but because they are undermined, that the servant who brings down an empire doesn't need to be visible to change the world. He just needs to be there, watching, waiting, and working. The Ming Dynasty fell in 1644, but its fall began years earlier in the quiet moments when servants passed information, when loyalties shifted, when the invisible people who kept the empire running decided to stop keeping it running. The collapse that seemed sudden and dramatic was actually the result of countless small actions by countless forgotten people. The servant who brought down the empire was not unique. He was simply one of many who had decided that enough was enough, that the system that oppressed them could be changed, that the people who were supposed to be powerless were not powerless at all. Every empire falls eventually. Every dynasty ends. Every system of oppression contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. And those seeds are often planted and tended by the very people who are supposed to be most loyal to the system. The servants who clean the halls, the scribes who copy the documents, the guards who watch the gates, the cooks who prepare the food. All of them are potential revolutionaries, potential agents of change, potential servants who could bring down empires. The story of the servant who brought down the Ming Dynasty is not really a story about the past. It's a story about the present and the future. It's a story about the power that exists in every workplace, every institution, every system of authority. It's a story about the potential for change that exists in every person who has ever felt powerless, every individual who has ever been overlooked, every human being who has ever been told that they don't matter. Because the truth is that everyone matters. Everyone has power. Everyone can change the world. The servant who brought down the Ming Dynasty understood this. He understood that his position as a servant was not a limitation but an opportunity. He understood that his invisibility was not a weakness but a strength. He understood that the people who are supposed to be powerless are often the most powerful of all. And that understanding changed everything. It changed the course of Chinese history. It changed the destiny of the most populous nation on earth. It changed the world. All because one servant decided that he would not remain invisible forever, that he would not accept powerlessness as permanent, that he would not allow the system that oppressed him to continue unchanged. The servant who brought down the Ming Dynasty proved that anyone can be a revolutionary. Anyone can be an agent of change. Anyone can bring down an empire. You just have to be patient. You just have to be observant. You just have to be willing to work, quietly and carefully, toward the change you want to see. Even if you're just serving tea. But let's go deeper into what it really meant to be you, to be Chang Wei, in those final days before the empire fell. Because the official histories, even the ones that acknowledge the role of internal resistance, don't capture the psychological weight of what you carried. They don't describe the nights when you lay awake on your straw mattress, listening to the snoring of your fellow servants, wondering if tomorrow would be the day you were discovered. They don't mention the constant calculation required to appear completely ordinary while systematically dismantling the most powerful government on earth. You developed rituals to maintain your sanity. Every morning, as you performed your ablutions at the communal wash basin, you would count the days since you had last passed information to your brother. Every evening, as you cleaned the Hall of Supreme Harmony, you would mentally review the conversations you had overheard, sorting them into categories: useful intelligence, dangerous gossip, meaningless court drama. Every night before sleep, you would recite the names of family members who had died during the famines and rebellions that the Ming government had failed to prevent. These weren't just memory exercises. They were acts of resistance, private ceremonies that reminded you why you were doing what you were doing. The psychological toll was enormous. You were living multiple lives simultaneously. During the day, you were Chang Wei the servant, invisible and obedient. During court sessions, you were Chang Wei the spy, gathering intelligence with the precision of a trained operative. In the evenings, you were Chang Wei the saboteur, spreading carefully crafted rumors and fostering conflicts between courtiers. At night, you were Chang Wei the revolutionary, planning the destruction of the system that had shaped your entire adult life. Each identity required different skills, different mindsets, different ways of being in the world. The mental compartmentalization was exhausting. But perhaps the most difficult part was the isolation. You couldn't share your real thoughts with anyone in the palace. You couldn't express your opinions about the Empire's policies or the Emperor's decisions. You couldn't even show normal human reactions to the cruelties you witnessed daily. When you saw servants beaten for minor infractions, you had to maintain the same blank expression as everyone else. When you heard about peasant uprisings being brutally suppressed, you had to nod along with the courtiers' approval. When you watched the Emperor make decisions that would lead to more suffering, you had to serve his tea with the same respectful demeanor as always. The emotional suppression required was inhuman. You were witnessing the systematic oppression of millions of people, and you had to pretend that it was normal, acceptable, even divinely ordained. You were surrounded by luxury that had been extracted from the labor of starving peasants, and you had to clean it, maintain it, and treat it as if it were sacred. You were serving people who made policy decisions that destroyed lives, and you had to treat them with deference and respect. But this emotional suppression also became a source of strength. Because you were forced to observe everything without reacting, you developed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to understand their motivations, to predict their actions. You learned to see beyond the elaborate ceremonies and formal hierarchies to the human weaknesses and petty concerns that actually drove imperial policy. You discovered that the most powerful people in the empire were often the most insecure, that the most confident public personas concealed the deepest private fears, that the system that seemed so stable was actually held together by anxiety and mutual blackmail. The courtiers who seemed so formidable during public ceremonies were revealed, in their unguarded moments, to be frightened, petty, and surprisingly incompetent. The emperor who projected divine authority was actually a nervous, indecisive man who relied heavily on advisors who were themselves uncertain and conflicted. The imperial system that claimed to be eternal and unchanging was actually a ramshackle collection of competing interests, personal vendettas, and short-term expedients. The more you observed, the more you realized that the empire was not a well-oiled machine, but a collection of human beings making things up as they went along. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant that the system was much more vulnerable than it appeared. Terrifying because it meant that the stability of the empire, which supported millions of people, was much more precarious than anyone understood. You were not just working to bring down a government. You were working to collapse a civilization, and the weight of that responsibility was sometimes overwhelming. There were moments when you questioned what you were doing. Late at night, when you couldn't sleep, you would think about the chaos that would follow the empire's collapse. You would imagine the wars, the famines, the mass displacement of people. You would wonder if your desire for revenge was worth the suffering that would inevitably result from the dynasty's fall. You would ask yourself whether the empire, for all its flaws, might be better than the alternative. But then, you would remember your brother's children, who had starved during the famine of 1641. You would think about the peasants who had been forced to sell their children to pay imperial taxes. You would recall the servants who had been executed for minor infractions, the families who had been destroyed by corrupt officials, the communities that had been devastated by imperial policies. And you would realize that the empire was not preventing suffering. It was causing it. The stability that it provided was purchased with the blood and labor of people who had no voice in its governance. The moral calculus was complex, but ultimately clear. The empire had to fall, not because it was evil, but because it was unjust. It had to be destroyed, not because you hated it, but because you loved the people it was oppressing. The revolution you were helping to foment was not an act of destruction, but an act of creation. You were not just bringing down an old system. You were making space for something new, something better, something more just. But the psychological cost of this work was enormous. You were constantly aware that discovery would mean not just your own death, but the deaths of everyone in your network. You knew that your brother's life depended on your ability to remain invisible, that the success of the rebellion depended on your capacity to continue gathering intelligence without being caught. The pressure was constant, unrelenting, and entirely invisible to everyone around you. You developed techniques for managing this pressure. You learned to compartmentalize your emotions, to store your anger and fear in mental containers that you could access when needed, but that wouldn't interfere with your daily performance. You practiced meditation techniques that helped you maintain your composure during stressful situations. You developed a form of internal dialogue that allowed you to process your experiences without expressing them outwardly. Most importantly, you learned to find meaning in small victories. Every piece of intelligence you gathered, every rumor you spread, every conflict you fostered was a tiny step toward the larger goal. You learned to celebrate these small successes privately, to draw strength from the knowledge that you were making progress even when that progress was invisible to everyone else. You developed a sense of purpose that sustained you through the most difficult moments. The network you were part of was larger and more sophisticated than you initially realized. There were servants in every part of the palace who were quietly gathering information and passing it along. There were merchants who carried messages between the palace and the outside world. There were low-ranking officials who were secretly sympathetic to the rebel cause. There were even some nobles who had become disillusioned with the imperial system and were willing to provide assistance to those working to bring it down. But the network was also fragile. It depended on the discretion and courage of dozens of individuals, any one of whom could be discovered and forced to reveal information about the others. The security protocols were elaborate and constantly evolving. Messages were coded, meetings were held in carefully chosen locations, and information was compartmentalized so that no single person knew too much about the overall operation. You were trained in these protocols gradually, as you proved your reliability and commitment. You learned to recognize coded signals, to use dead drops, to communicate through seemingly innocent conversations. You mastered the art of appearing completely ordinary while engaging in activities that would have been considered treasonous if discovered. You became skilled at reading people's faces and body language, at detecting signs of suspicion or surveillance, at knowing when to act and when to wait. The training was informal but thorough. Experienced members of the network would teach newer recruits through example, demonstration, and careful guidance. You learned not just the technical skills of espionage, but the psychological techniques necessary to maintain your cover identity. You practiced maintaining your composure under pressure, controlling your facial expressions, managing your emotional responses to stressful situations. The most important skill you developed was the ability to see without being seen. You learned to observe conversations without appearing to listen, to gather information without seeming curious, to understand situations without asking questions. You became skilled at positioning yourself in rooms so that you could overhear important discussions, at timing your movements so that you could witness significant events, at appearing busy with menial tasks while actually focusing on more important activities. This skill set made you incredibly valuable to the network, but it also made you incredibly dangerous to the Empire. You were essentially a human surveillance system, gathering intelligence that was more detailed and more accurate than anything the imperial government could have obtained through its own agents. You knew the personal habits of the emperor, the private conversations of the courtiers, the internal conflicts within the imperial administration. You understood the empire's weaknesses better than the emperor himself. But perhaps your most important contribution to the network was not the information you gathered, but the analysis you provided. Because you had been in the palace for 15 years, you understood the patterns of imperial behavior, the cycles of policy making, the relationships between different factions within the government. You could predict how the emperor would respond to various crises, how the courtiers would react to different types of pressure, how the imperial system would adapt to changing circumstances. This analytical ability made you indispensable to the rebel leadership. Your assessments of imperial strength and weakness were crucial to their strategic planning. Your predictions about government responses helped them time their operations more effectively. Your understanding of palace politics allowed them to exploit divisions within the imperial administration. You were not just a spy. You were a strategic advisor, helping to guide the rebellion from within the very heart of the empire. The irony was profound. The empire that had enslaved you was now dependent on your labor to maintain its basic functions. The system that had dehumanized you was now vulnerable to your analysis of its weaknesses. The government that had ignored your existence was now being undermined by your intimate knowledge of its operations. The servant who was supposed to be invisible had become the most important person in the palace, even though nobody knew it. As the rebellion gathered strength and the empire's position became more precarious, your role became even more crucial. You were not just gathering intelligence about static conditions. You were monitoring a rapidly changing situation, tracking the empire's responses to increasing pressure, documenting the breakdown of imperial authority in real time. Your reports became essential reading for the rebel leadership, who relied on your analysis to understand what was happening within the imperial government. The final weeks before the empire's fall were a blur of activity. You were working almost constantly, gathering information, analyzing developments, passing intelligence to your contacts. The palace was in chaos, with courtiers fleeing, officials defecting, and the emperor himself becoming increasingly isolated and desperate. You watched the empire collapse from the inside, documenting its death throes with the same meticulous attention you had once given to serving tea. When Li Zicheng's forces finally entered Beijing, when the palace gates were breached and the emperor was found dead, you felt not triumph but exhaustion. The work was finished. The empire had fallen. The dynasty was over. And you, the invisible servant, had played a crucial role in making it happen. But you were also aware that the real work was just beginning. Bringing down an empire was only the first step. Building something better would be much more difficult. The servant who brought down the Ming Dynasty had accomplished something extraordinary. He had proven that ordinary people could shape history, that the powerless could become powerful, that systems of oppression could be changed. But he had also learned that change is difficult, that power is complicated, that revolution is just the beginning of a longer process of transformation. The empire fell, but the work of creating a more just society had only just begun. And that work, like the work of bringing down the empire, would require patience, persistence, and the contributions of countless ordinary people who understood that history is not made by the powerful, but by the powerless who refuse to remain powerless, even if they're just serving tea. The revolution begins with the person who decides that the way things are is not the way things have to be. It begins with the individual who understands that power is not permanent, that hierarchies are not natural, that systems of oppression can be changed. It begins with the servant who realizes that he is not really a servant at all, but a human being with agency, with dignity, with the ability to shape his own destiny and the destiny of his world. The servant who brought down the Ming Dynasty was not exceptional. He was ordinary. He was one person among millions, one face in an endless crowd, one voice in a chorus of the voiceless. But he made a choice. He chose to act. He chose to resist. He chose to change what could be changed. And that choice, multiplied by the choices of countless others like him, brought down an empire that had seemed eternal. That's the real lesson of his story. Not that some people are naturally powerful and others are naturally powerless, but that power is something that can be claimed, something that can be seized, something that can be used to create change. The servant who brought down the Ming Dynasty claimed his power. He used it to change the world, and in doing so he proved that anyone can do the same. The empire fell. The dynasty ended. The system changed. And somewhere in the ruins of the old order a servant smiled. Not because he had won, but because he had proven that winning was possible. Not because he had gained power, but because he had demonstrated that power was there for the taking. Not because he had become visible, but because he had shown that the invisible could become the most important people in history. The servant who brought down the Ming Dynasty changed the world, but more importantly, he proved that the world could be changed. And that proof, that demonstration, that example, continues to inspire people to this day. People who feel powerless, people who believe they don't matter, people who think that change is impossible. The servant who brought down the Ming Dynasty whispers to them across the centuries, "You are not powerless. You do matter. Change is possible. The empire can fall. The dynasty can end. The system can be transformed. All it takes is patience, observation, and the willingness to act when the moment is right. Even if you're just serving tea."